On December 7, 1947, the Japanese military launched an attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack decimated the U.S. Pacific Fleet, killing 2,403 Americans and wounding 1,000. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise, despite the warnings. The United States and Japan had been teetering on the edge of war for decades up until this point. The U.S. was unhappy with Japan's increasing belligerence towards China. The Japanese government believed that the only way to solve their economic and demographic problems was to expand into China's territory, taking over their import market. In 1937, Japan declared war on China and invaded its northern border. The conflict resulted in many atrocities, including the Nanking Massacre. In July 1940, the U.S. attempted to halt the imperial expansion in Asia by imposing trade sanctions and an oil embargo. In doing so, this reduced Japan's oil imports by 90%, effectively crippling Japan's ability to push offensive war efforts in the long term. The United States' response to Japan's aggression with a battery of sanctions and embargoes didn't come without its reasons. The escalating discord between Japan and China influenced U.S. relations with both nations between 1937 and 1941. At the outset, many U.S. officials viewed developments in China with ambivalence. On one hand, the U.S. opposed Japanese descent into China and the rise of militarism in the area because of their long-standing friendship with China. On the other hand, other U.S. officials believed that it had no vital interests in China worth going to war over with Japan. The domestic conflict between Chinese nationalists and communists left American policymakers uncertain of success in aiding such a divided nation. As a result of this, little help from the U.S. came for China in fear of Japanese provocation. The likelihood of the U.S. providing aid to China rose in chances after July 7, 1937, when Chinese and Japanese forces clashed on the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. This was the official start of a full-scale war. The United States watched as Japanese forces swept down the coast into the capital of Nanjing. Tensions rose even higher when the Japanese army bombed the USS Panay, who at the time was evacuating U.S. citizens from Nanjing. This attack killed 3 Americans. The United States accepted the Japanese apologies without retaliation taking place. In 1940 and 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt formalized U.S. aid to China and extended credits to the Chinese government for war supplies. The U.S. was the main supplier of the oil, steel, iron, and other wartime commodities that the Japanese needed. They were becoming bogged down by the Chinese resistance, but in January of 1940, Japan abrogated the existing Treaty of Commerce with the U.S. This didn't lead to an immediate embargo, but it allowed for the Roosevelt administration to restrict the flow of military supplies into Japan. Instead of imposing embargoes and sanctions, the U.S. used this fact as leverage to force Japan to halt its aggression. In 1940, the U.S. used a combined strategy of increasing credits to China and the Lend-Lease program in hopes of stopping the conflict altogether. Over the next 2 years, the Japanese government made several decisions that made the nation appear as more of a threat to the U.S. In response to the growing threat, Washington halted all negotiations with Tokyo and began instituting a full embargo on exports to Japan, froze all Japanese assets in U.S. banks, and sent more wartime supplies into China along the Burma Road. In early 1941, U.S. intelligence cracked the Japanese code and began decoding all intercepted diplomatic messages. There was no trust to be had between the two nations. U.S. decoders intercepted messages from Japanese diplomats in late January discussing their plans for an attack on Pearl Harbor. Joseph C. Grew, a U.S. ambassador to Japan, sent word to Washington warning them of the attack, but no one believed him. Military experts believed that an attack from Asia was most likely. 9 months following the grave discovery, Japan sent Ambassador Kichisaburo Namura to Washington to discuss potential diplomatic solutions with the U.S. When a solution wasn't found, the submarines departed from Pearl Harbor and began to prepare themselves for war. On November 26th, a final attempt at diplomacy from the Japanese was rejected by President Roosevelt. The negotiations between Washington and Tokyo proved to be futile. Japanese aircraft carriers and escorts departed for Pearl Harbor in response to the rejection. The following day, with a pit in his stomach, President Roosevelt issued a war warning for the Pacific, which was heavily ignored by Hawaii. The day before the Pearl Harbor attack, U.S. intelligence decoded a vital message containing the go-ahead orders for an undetermined Japanese action. The details of the message were delivered to Washington with haste 4 hours ahead of the attack, but the message never made it to the commanders in Honolulu. At 7:02 a.m. on December 7th, 2 U.S. radar operators identified several large groups of aircraft in flight heading towards the island of Oahu from the north. Because the commanders were expecting a fleet of B-17s from the U.S., the operators didn't sound the alarm. 53 minutes later, a swarm of Japanese warplanes descended on Honolulu, attacking the ships in Pearl Harbor. Air stations at Hickam, Wheeler, Ford Island, Kaneohe, and Eva Field were also attacked. For 2 hours and 20 minutes, the United States fought tooth and nail to fend off their Pacific invaders. Despite the suddenness of the attack, the American servicemen still fought back. Doris "Dory" Miller, a messman 3rd class, was stationed on board the USS West Virginia when the boat was ravaged by torpedoes. Without falter, he rushed to report for duty. Miller aided in moving their wounded captain to safety and then took his place behind a Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun. He fired until there was no more ammunition. As the ship sank further into the water below, Miller continued to do his duty and assisted in moving wounded sailors to the upper decks. He saved numerous lives. Many airmen were able to get their aircraft into the sky while their runways were under attack. Second Lieutenants Kenneth M. Taylor and George Welch were sleeping off their late-night Christmas party when the sounds of machine gun fire and explosions stirred them. Still wearing their tuxedos from the night before, the airmen raced to their aircraft. Together, Lieutenant Taylor and Welch shot down 7 Japanese aircraft. The gallantry of these men, as well as others, saved countless lives that day. The aftermath of the attack left Pearl Harbor in shambles. Over 300 aircraft and 18 ships had been destroyed. More than 2,400 American lives were lost. On December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress with a speech urging for a formal declaration of war against Japan. Millions of Americans listened live, and within the hour, the United States joined the Second World War.